Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Blood Death Knight in patch 10.0, the Dragonflight Pre-patch. Blood DK is usually considered one of the best tanks in WoW, both in Mythic Plus and in raids, which is something that sets it apart from basically every other tank. It's not always the best, or even always good, but when it is good, it's pretty much good at everything. And it is usually good. Paladin usually does really well in pushing high-level Mythic Plus, but struggles to survive in raids. Monk does really well in raids basically all the time, but usually struggles in Mythic Plus. Like this last Season 3 and 4 of Shadowlands, where Monk was really strong in Mythic Plus, is a little bit out of the ordinary for them. But Blood DK being good in raid and Mythic Plus for Seasons 3 and 4 is very normal. Blood DK was the runaway favorite tank in the 3rd and 4th seasons of Shadowlands. In the first couple, it was a little slow, a little boring, and as a result, early Shadowlands was kind of a downtime for DKs. It wasn't very popular in high-level Mythic Plus or raiding. It wasn't horrible. DK tanks did get used by some guilds in Sanctum of Domination, but it wasn't the no-question #1 tank in the game until it got tier set bonuses and Sepulchre of the first ones. At that point, you could maintain 100% Dancing Rune weapon uptime and a 40% strength buff and basically be permanently unkillable while also doing enormous amounts of damage. The only weaknesses that DK had were that the rotation was pretty unforgiving. Not really that complicated, just very unforgiving if you made mistakes. And the class is still very slow moving. I played DK for a few fights in Sepulchre progression, and I enjoyed the idea of that playstyle more than actually playing it, to be honest. Spamming Heartstrike at the expense of most of the rest of your rotation was actually pretty boring to me. And I'm glad that that playstyle has gone away in the pre-patch. I think that's an unpopular opinion, though. I think for the most part, certainly most of the players I've spoken with, Blood DKs are a little upset about losing those tier set bonuses. But they're gone now, so no sense crying over spilt tier sets. It is a big change, but I think Blood DK is a lot more interesting now rotationally and a lot more fun to play. It's also still very strong. Now let's jump into the important stuff. Blood DK has a pretty complicated playstyle. It's definitely a more advanced tank than Warrior Druid or Demon Hunter. As they're currently designed, it probably is less complicated than Brewmaster Monk right now. It's definitely not impossible to play, it's just, there's a little bit to manage while you're playing a DK. It has 2 resource management systems. Runes recharge over time, and runic power is fueled by spending runes. You use runes to maintain Bone Shield and deal damage, and you use runic power to cast Death Strike, which heals you for a percentage of all the damage you've taken recently. You also have a really big collection of powerful defensive cooldowns, some decent offensive cooldowns, and 3 different methods for moving enemies around: Death Grip, Gorfine's Grasp, and Abomination Limb. DKs are really... basically, they're always strong at grouping up adds so they can be cleaved down easily. It makes them really useful in any sort of add fights and raids, and, pretty nice in Mythic Plus whenever there are any casters or archer-type enemies around. Blood is a little bit better at doing that than Frost or Unholy as well. In terms of how much the spec has changed with the pre-patch, a lot of the abilities look and mostly function the same, but the way that you use them is very different. For example, you now want to maintain Death and Decay all the time while you're tanking. This is a bit like how Paladins use Consecration and have used Consecration for years. It's a pretty substantial change for DKs from the old playstyle, where you would basically only cast Death and Decay if you were in AoE. The class has also gained a lot of resource generation from talents, which makes the base playstyle feel way better than it used to in the earlier seasons of Shadowlands. On top of that, Deathstrike has a lot of talents that affect it, and it both costs less and heals more than it did during Shadowlands, so Blood DK's potential to self-sustain is even better than it has been in the recent past. Damage mitigation overall is weaker, now that you can't permanently maintain Dancing Rune weapon, but the class is looking pretty good. And on that note, let's just go over the question, how strong is Blood DK in 10.0? I think it's really, really good. I think it's still one of the best tanks in the game. The amount of self-healing that Blood DKs can put out is better than ever. You have several talents that let you increase your self-shielding, increase your death strike value, reduce its cost, generate resources, and so on, and it all adds up really quickly to make DKs really hard to kill. Now let's dive in game, look at the talent tree, go through the key talents, and point out the important stuff. Alright, here we are. This is the Blood DK talent tree, and I have 3 talent setups I just want to go over here. We'll start with the sort of basic raid setup, and this is something you can run for everything. Then there is a Mythic Plus build that has a little bit of customizability and just a few more, group-oriented choices that are better for Mythic Plus, and then a grip-specific build that basically is only for fights where you really need a lot of AoE grip tools. Fights like Anduin or Halandris, both in Sepulchre of the first ones. I'm sure there are other bosses off the top of the dome. Soul Render Dormazane in Sanctum of Domination. Yeah, I remembered his name. There we go. That might be it. Anyways, let's start with the basic raid setup, and I'm just going to kind of walk through the talents here. Chains of Ice is a pretty non-essential skill. I mean, it's a ranged slow. That's not bad to have, but you have to take it to get Mind Freeze, and I would never play any class that has an interrupt and not take the interrupt, so that's pretty non-negotiable. Death Strike you get for free. Obviously, you cannot play Blood DK without Death Strike. Raise Dead, you could theoretically not take any of this stuff on the right side. You could path over to this stuff down here, which you want, by coming down through here. But Raise Dead is, 1 point, and it's a cheapo little offensive cooldown that's pretty nice, so it's worth having. And you also get Cleaving Strikes, which is really essential for being able to deal any sort of AoE damage. It's pretty hard to imagine ever playing Blood without this. I mean, it would technically be meaningless to have this talent in 1 or 2 target situations. It doesn't really add anything, but it's just sort of one of those things that seems difficult to justify ever not taking. Anti-Magic Shell is another essential talent. I would never play Blood DK without having Anti-Magic, or any spec of DK actually, without having Anti-Magic Shell. Blinding Sleet over here on the left is a pretty nice little AoE CC tool that is useful in Mythic Plus and any sort of situation where you need to AoE CC, obviously. Like, I could see this being useful on Anduin. Getting 3 seconds off the cooldown of your interrupt is actually pretty decent. I think for caster heavy Mythic Plus dungeons, I could see running this, but Permafrost giving you 40% of all your auto attack damage as an absorb shield is pretty nice. This is not mandatory, but definitely a good talent to have in any situation at all. Same here with improved Death Strike, -5 to the runic power cost and 10% more healing to your main defensive skill. That's pretty crazy, and they just kind of tuck it in here in a weird spot where it looks like it isn't really worth much. But this is an incredibly strong talent that you get very early on and for very cheap. Anti-Magic Barrier is sort of a mixed bag. There are a lot of fights where you might not take any meaningful magic damage in raids, and this wouldn't actually be worth much. And then there are fights where you have some sort of spell that you can mitigate every 45 seconds, and this makes it so that instead of being able to mitigate every other one, you're able to mitigate every single one. Like, Eye of the Jailer is like kind of an easy fight, but it's a good example where the beam on that fight is, I think, every 45 seconds. So if you pop this and walk through it, it doesn't do any damage to you. So by having this talent, you're able to immune all of them instead of just every other one. You will still, in that case, need to layer Death's Advance to not get knocked back by the eye beam, but that's a 45-second cooldown as well, so. March of Darkness is a nice talent. I like this talent, but there is a conduit that does the same thing, and they don't stack. So at this point, I would rather just take the conduit, but I probably will use this talent a lot more once the expansion is live. Next 2 talents, not really that valuable for Blood. Control undead can be in Mythic Plus situations where you have a really strong undead enemy that you could mind control and then use as a pet, but it's sort of a really valuable or totally worthless kind of option. Enfeeble adds a little bit of defensive value onto using your Raised Dead, your Summon Ghoul. It's not a lot of defensive value. I think the proc rate on this is like a couple of procs while he's active. But still, any amount of defensive value at all out of this guy is better than none. Icebound Fortitude, this is pretty non-negotiable. This is like a main defensive cooldown for the class, and a pretty nice piece of utility, so you're gonna pretty much always want to take it. The 3% leech and 3% avoidance talents here, these are okay for pathing, but not great, and you are able to get around them, and you know, they're pretty low value for a talent point. Veteran of the Third War, this is 20% more life for 2 points. It's A+, must have. This talent right here, your diseases have a chance to weaken your enemy, causing your attacks to deal more damage. Basically just a simple, uncontrollable damage increase on the target. Not like crazy value, but useful for pathing down the tree, and definitely better than 3% avoidance, considering they're the same price and the same value for pathing. 2% strength is okay, 2% crit is okay. The real value here is just that they activate like much better pathing, certainly compared to these two passive nodes, which don't really do much for pathing. These passive nodes give you a lot of pathing options deeper into the tree. If you're in a situation where you need to AoE slow, Proliferating Chill is going to be way weaker than just taking Grip of the Dead, which will give you an actual AoE slow on Death and Decay, and it's quite a lot stronger. 15% stronger absorbs, it's just direct defensive value, pretty good, and certainly a lot better than Chains of Ice, hitting 2 targets. Not having Asphyxiate is kind of weird, like just giving up the stun that has more or less defined the class for as long as I can remember playing it. It's kind of strange, but you know, it's not really very useful for pathing in a lot of situations, so let it go, I guess. Anti-Magic Zone is another skill where it can be totally essential for raids, for mitigating damage for the group in a raid situation. It just kind of depends on the fight. There are a lot of fights where you're not going to get any value out of this. There are a lot of situations in Mythic Plus where you're not going to get any value out of this, considering everyone has to stack up. So I probably wouldn't run this in a Mythic Plus setup, but this is a pretty good one to have in any sort of default raid talent setup. Over here, Unholy Endurance just adds another defensive cooldown, takes Lichborn from being just this, you know, Fear Break, Charm, Sleep, immunity on a 2-minute cooldown to a nice little defensive cooldown. Not bad. Giving up Wraith Walk is a little annoying. The fact that you have to take Asphyxiate or Assimilation, where you're now doubling down onto the value of Anti-Magic Zone, which is already a little situational, or take Death Pact, which is a very questionable defensive, like, self-heal cooldown. Like, you're spending 2 points to get a pretty sus mobility skill. It's an option, but you have to give up some pretty good value elsewhere to get it. And now let's get into what I think are the real, like, meat of the tree here, and that is Runic Attenuation, which has, I think, a 10 proc per minute, 10 or 12 procs per minute rate, so it gives you about 1.5 to 2 death strikes per minute, which is very nice. And Unholy Ground, which gives you 5% haste whenever you're in Death and Decay. And because the playstyle now is to be in Death and Decay all the time, that's just a constant 5% haste scaler. That's excellent. Insidious Chill makes it so that your auto attacks reduce the target's auto attack speed. This is basically the Curse of Weakness debuff. It's just been given to Blood DK, or all DKs now, and it's a really cheap pathing node to get down to some nice talents down here. Icy Talons tacks a little bit of attack speed onto just simply casting Death Strike every 6 seconds. Kind of creates a little bit of a rotation where you want to Death Strike every 6 seconds and then you're keeping this up. It's actually a pretty good buff, and it'll add a lot of damage. It adds a lot of defensive value with Permafrost. It adds more runic power with Runic Attenuation, potentially. It's just nice. And it finishes off with Empower Rune Weapon down here, which, let me just spin some runes to show off. There we go, all my runes are on cooldown. Now I'm going to tap it, and watch, see, it's regenerating them pretty quickly. Just spend some more. Yeah, you know, really nice rune generation cooldown. Now, because I attacked a training dummy, a tank training dummy, I'm going to, like, spend forever stuck in combat. Hopefully not. Alright then. Blood Draw, this talent here that's to the right of Insidious Chill. It's not only is it 2 points, as you can see, it's 4k health for the first point. If I were to tap 2 points into it, there we go. It actually is not scaling up. It is supposed to, but you can see that it's not. It's a 3-minute cooldown. It heals you for a very small amount of your health, like less than 5% of my max health. It's quite bad. Stunningly bad talent here. And now over here we have Will of the Necropolis, which is one of the best talents, certainly one of the most like iconic components of Blood DK's design historically. Having an always on shield wall whenever your health is low is really, really good in conjunction with Death Strike. I am still in combat. Alright, I'm going to Garrison Hearth. Alright. Will of the Necropolis, it's great. The only real problem with it here is just simply the expense of getting down to your 2 Empower Rune Weapon, which is great and definitely worth going to get, but it means that you only have 1 point left over to get Will of the Necropolis, because you have to take Death's Echo. Death's Echo is not just excellent quality of life, it really has a positive impact on the way you play the class. Because you're trying to keep Death and Decay down all the time now, Crimson Scourge, which I will... No, it's a talent now. I'm sure I'll find... There it is. Crimson Scourge makes it so that auto attacks on blood-plagued targets, which all targets will be blood-plagued, have a chance to make your Death and Decay cost no runes and reset its cooldown. Now, normally that means that if you had Death and Decayed, it's a 15-second cooldown, maybe it's been 10 seconds since you cast it, you trigger Crimson Scourge, you get it back off cooldown. Wow, 5 seconds off the cooldown. Great. With this, you would cast it, same situation, you would be 5 seconds away from the 1 recharge coming back. You could have already cast another one, now you have 2 of them on cooldown, one's at 5 seconds, and then one is, still 15 seconds after that. You get a recharge instead of 5 seconds back, you're getting a full charge, you're getting 15 full seconds back. This completely changes the way that you approach using Death and Decay. Additionally, Death's Advance and Death Grip, having an additional charge, is really nice quality of life. There are tons of situations in playing WoW where you might need to use a mobility skill more than twice in 45 seconds. And there are tons of situations where you will need to Death Grip 2 enemies over to you in the span of 10 or 15 seconds, or grip 1 enemy and then they leap back out and you grip them back in. Obviously, we've all been there. And having this totally makes that doable. It makes it very easily, just a non-issue, essentially. Finally, Rune Mastery and Unholy Bond. These are both a little underwhelming in terms of just their overall impact. Rune Mastery's proc rate is a little low for a 2 points to get 6% strength as an occasional proc. Abomination Limb is great. I'll go over that more in the sort of the grippy setup. And, if you just stick with Necrolord, then you'll have it. And Unholy Bond is actually kind of underwhelming, and Soul Reaper, even though I love it conceptually, I love being able to tag enemies with Soul Reaper and get those huge procs when they're at low health. It's like a cool execute effect. It's actually pretty bad for your rotation because it costs a rune, and unlike Heartstrike over here, which generates 15 runic power, this only generates 10. So it's not very good. Now over here on the spec tree, you have Heartstrike at the top. It's a pretty mandatory talent. Really, all of these top 5 are mandatory. Marrow Rend you have to take. Blood Boil you have to take, and you're going to want to use it anyway. Vampiric Blood, same thing. Crimson Scourge. It's great. Your first little choice comes right here in this line, this row. Descaress is great, you want to take that for sure. Ossuary, same thing. They both have nice impacts on the rotation. Your choice here is between improved Vampiric Blood, which gives you 4 extra seconds on Vampiric Blood's duration and 10% more healing and absorb intake while it's up. This has pretty nice synergy with Red Thirst, but right now there aren't really enough talent points available to get Red Thirst, and it doesn't really have as much value as some of the other talents that are near it at the current moment. Taking improved Heartstrike is just a DPS increase. Like, this is a defensive increase, this is a DPS increase, but this is actually a pretty substantial DPS increase, and this isn't that substantial of a defensive gain. Rune Tap is actually kind of on the outs. I've never really loved this talent anyway. You are essentially using one rune to get a very, very small defensive cooldown layer instead of just using one rune to do a bunch of damage and get 15 runic power that you could spend on Death Strike. So it's never really been a good gamble, but there have been some times where it was worth it. But as it's currently located in the tree, it's pretty hard to justify taking. In raids, Heartbreaker is not really a great talent. Fell Bulwark isn't a huge value talent either. You know, at most you're going to get 10% more max health, but usually it's more like 5 to 7% more max health. That's not bad for a single talent, and it is cheaper than Heartbreaker, which costs 2. It's good for pathing down the tree, but it's not great. Dancing Rune Weapon is absolutely essential. You're going to want to take this 3-line row or column of talents in every Blood DK build. I cannot imagine a Blood DK build that will not take Dancing Rune Weapon, which is a great defensive cooldown that reduces your auto attack damage taken significantly. Insatiable Blade, which greatly reduces its cooldown and makes it into a nice Bone Shield charge generator. And Everlasting Bond, which increases its duration and increases its value as a runic power generator and Bone Shield charge generator. All 3 of these, great synergy, totally worth building your whole tree around getting those. Hemostasis makes using Blood Boil in AoE turn into a Death Strike damage and healing increase. It's great in AoE, kind of worthless in single target. Raids tend to be more single target oriented, so this is very much an optional talent. It's not bad in raids, it's just, you know, it does need to be like multi-target raid situations. If it's just 1 to 2 targets, kind of worthless. I like the idea of Perseverance of the Ebon Blade, it's just 2 points for this proc is not enough. Relish in Blood is not really a talent I ever loved, but it is a good runic power generator, and it does give you a decent amount of healing when you cast Death and Decay when you have a Crimson Scourge proc up. More importantly, it's just a good pathing option for getting down here into this section of the tree, which is really, really nice. Improved Bone Shield is an absolute must-have talent. 10% haste all the time when you're tanking. Amazing. Leeching Strike over here is okay as a healing talent when you're in Mythic Plus or AoE. It's not great, but it synergizes nicely with Heartbreaker, so it's a talent that you're going to want to take if you're taking Heartbreaker, more of an AoE option. These 2 talents, Blood Drinker and Consumption, add active damage skills that don't really do a lot of damage. Consumption looks cool. It was the Legion legendary or Legion artifact weapon ability. I've always loved the animation, one of my favorites of all time, but it's not good. I was gonna spec into it to show it off. Let's take a look. Let's see if that animation is still as cool as I remember. It didn't bother to put it on my bars. Okay. All right, here we go. Terrible. They nerfed it. The only thing it had going for it was its cool animation where you leap up in the air and slam down, and now it's just a frontal cleave. Yeah, never take this talent. I'm so disappointed. Rapid Decomposition is a pretty decent self-healing and damage increase. It just makes your dot effects, which are Blood Plague and Death and Decay do 15% more damage. It also makes it so that your Blood Plague will leech more health. It doesn't really add up to a huge amount, but it is a non-zero increase, and again, you need it to path deeper into the tree. Reinforced Bones is one of the weaker talents in the tree. 10% more armor from Bone Shield is pretty insignificant, but again, you need it to path deeper into the tree. Voracious is incredible. 20% more Death Strike healing basically just means 20% more healing. 15% leech for 8 seconds after you Death Strike pretty much just means 15% leech all the time. Bloodworms is optional, but there's not a lot of other great talents to spend up here, and you need to spend, as you can see, 1 more point to get down into this area. It's an okay little cheapo defensive cooldown in raids anyway. They pop when you're low health, and they heal you for a little bit. Okay, over on the left side, Tombstone is an incredible synergistic talent that pairs up very nicely with Dancing Rune Weapon and Insatiable Blade. Whenever you use it, as long as you have 5 Bone Shield charges or more, it will give you the cooldown reduction from losing those 5 Bone Shield charges, so it's an instant 25 Bone Shield, or 25 seconds of cooldown reduction on Dancing Rune Weapon. It also gives you 30 runic power and a shield worth 30% of your max health. Very valuable talent. Kind of weird that it's not in line with this row of talents that it perfectly synergizes with, but it doesn't matter. It's worth coming over to get. Gorfine's Grasp is a talent in raid that's either useless or mandatory, and kind of never anywhere in between. For the most part, you know, you look at a fight where there's no adds to grip, there's no value for it. Sire Denathrius, worthless. A fight like Anduin, where there's a ton of adds to grip in multiple phases of the fight, it's absolutely mandatory. I played Blood DK in Prague so that I could use Gorfine's Grasp instead of my Monk, which was much tankier. Sanguine Ground and Coagulopathy are 2 really nice damage increases. Coagulopathy, 5% damage increase all the time, and then the little tack in of Death Strike causing Blood Plague to do more damages. Whatever, but it synergizes or lines up nicely with the leech bonus from Voracious, and with the attack speed increase from spending runic power from Icy Talons. You know, you have this incentive to be Death Striking fairly regularly. It just rewards you with more damage, which also heals you. Not bad. And Sanguine Ground synergizes wonderfully with Unholy Ground. 5% more haste here, 5% more damage and healing here. Really nice talent combination. Shattering Bone is one of my favorite talents in the tree. I thought it was a really stupid idea when I first saw it at the very beginning of the alpha for Dragonflight, but as I've gotten a chance to play with it, it really does a lot of damage, and they finally fixed one of the biggest issues with it, which was that when you would Tombstone and eat 5 Bone Shield charges, it would only do 1 Bone Shield's worth of damage, which was bad. Now it does all 5 worth of damage, and because you're going to be in a Death and Decay basically all the time, if you Tombstone while you're in Death and Decay, it's going to do triple damage, and it's 5 hits at once, so it's actually a pretty substantial hit. It basically turns Tombstone into a nice little offensive cooldown. Ironheart gives you more Blood Shield duration, which isn't really a huge deal for the most part, but it also absorbs 20% more damage, which is pretty nice. It's a nice little multiplier on your mastery. Red Thirst, as I kind of hinted at before, is a talent I like, and it synergizes nicely with improved Vampiric Blood, but it is pretty deep in the tree and pretty expensive at the current amount of talent points we have at level 60, and it's not gating anything that's all that great. Umbilicus Eternus is pretty lame. I think this will be a talent that's worth running at level 70, and it is a talent you could spec into now. Like, you could drop Ironheart and Bloodshot to take Red Thirst. I just think you get a little bit more overall value out of these two, a little more always on value than you do out of taking Red Thirst. But this is very much a comfort play. You could use either. Finally, Bloodshot gives you 25% increased physical damage, which applies to Death Strike, Heart Strike, Marrow Rend, and that's it. Yeah, that's it. Everything else you do is spell damage, but Death Strike and Heart Strike are your main damage dealing spells. Like, let me pull up a recent damage log from something that wasn't a tanking dummy that I hit for 2 seconds. Here we go. 3 minutes on a tanking dummy, 20% Death Strike, 20% melee, 12% Heart Strike. You know, everything else is pretty much spell damage, but that's still quite a bit over 50% physical damage. So that's a pretty good damage increase, 12-ish% damage increase while Blood Shield is active. Not bad. And just to kind of touch on some of the talents here, Bone Storm, not great. The damage tuning on Bone Storm has never been that great. It's kind of annoying to use, and it really burns up a lot of runic power to do pretty mediocre damage. Heartrend is a terribly undertuned, very low proc chance increase on your Death Strike very occasionally. Not a good talent. Tightening Grasp is okay if you need Gorfine's Grasp and you need to grip more often than every 2 minutes, and 90 seconds will do it for you. I guess it's alright, but whatever. Purgatory is okay. It's a cheat death on a 4-minute cooldown. The biggest problem I have with it is just that you kind of have to pass through some situational or just straight up bad talents to get it. And you could just be getting like more absorb damage or absorb value, or more damage output, or more damage output, or more defensive cooldowns. Like, there's just so many better options available than taking Purg. Now let's take a look at the Mythic Plus build, which, as you're going to see, is very similar. In this one, I'm taking Blinding Sleep because I like having the ability to AoE CC. You can see that the bottoms of this tree and this tree are pretty close. The basics like Mind Freeze and Anti-Magic Shell and so on are all the same. I am skipping Anti-Magic Barrier for Mythic Plus. I think it's quite a bit less valuable. I'm skipping Anti-Magic Zone because it's kind of hard for groups to get any value out of. Like, you know, you can throw it on a ranged player and that might work, but the idea of getting people to stack up into an Anti-Magic Zone in a Mythic Plus is pretty uncommon. You could drop Will of the Necropolis. No, not Will of the Necropolis. You could drop Grip of the Dead to pick up Asphyxiate. That's an option if you're not interested in kiting at all. You could definitely do that for a little bit more crowd control for your group. But that's about it. The skeleton is pretty similar. You could also drop Blinding Sleep for Cold Thirst, just to have access to more interrupts. You could also take Acclamation if you would like to have more defensive cooldown availability, but Icebound Fortitude isn't that game-changing. Again, you're going to want to take Heart Strike, Marrow Rend, all that good stuff. Hemostasis is worth taking for Mythic Plus. Bloodworms is fine, but, you know, not as good proportionally now. What changes in the left side of the tree here is Heartbreaker becomes really valuable in Mythic Plus because it's generating 2 additional runic power for everyone you hit. You're going to be hitting a lot more people thanks to being in Death and Decay all the time. You're going to be hitting essentially 5 people every time, so that's an extra 10 runic power with every Death Strike. Heart Strike, I mean. That's great. Leeching Strike isn't an amazing talent, but it does make it so that every Heart Strike will heal you for, in all-out AoE, 2.5% of your health. That's not too bad, and it lets you path through Blood Tap, which is a great resource-generating talent. It lets you skip Reinforced Bones, which is a talent that isn't great in any way, and you still get Tombstone. Again, you're only able to get 1 point into Shattering Bone because you really want to take Sanguine Ground. 5% more damage and healing all the time is better than that 2nd point in Shattering Bone. You could drop Voracious or Hemostasis, or technically both, and take Bone Storm if you really wanted to pump out as much AoE damage as you could. That's fine, but you don't want to give up Improved Bone Shield, you don't want to give up Sanguine Ground or Coagulopathy, and you got to get down there to get those talents, so the only way to get there cheaply is through Relish in Blood and Rapid Decomp. And now, here we have what I'm calling the Raid Grippy build. You could run this in Mythic Plus if you wanted to be gripping stuff in Mythic Plus, that's fine, but I think that the other build is definitely better. As you can see, I'm taking Asphyxiate because in my mind I would be doing Anduin and I would need to be able to help stun. Maybe you would want to help AoE CC instead and you'd rather take Blinding Sleet. Either way, you're definitely going to want to have Death's Echo so that you can have multiple charges of Death Grip. You're definitely going to be having a Bomb Limb since that's the whole point of this build, and Gorfine's Grasp because same thing. You do unfortunately have to path down through Reinforced Bones just to have enough points to get Gorfine's Grasp. And then in my mind, I think that going through Bloodshot is the right move here, but you could drop those and take Red Thirst if you want to be a little bit more defensively oriented, or Shattering Bone if you wanted to be all-out offense. I think that Ironheart and Bloodshot kind of threads the needle right between those two of just being a nice sort of offense and defensive split. I think if you were to take Red Thirst, you probably would want to take improved Vampiric Blood and drop improved Heartstrike. It's quite a bit of an offensive loss, so I would really only run that if I'm really struggling to stay alive, but if you are, there you go. Alright, that's it. Let's go back and take a look at the rotation section. The basics of Blood DK tanking are the same as they've been for a couple of expansions. Maintain Bone Shield whenever you're tanking, even when you're not tanking, it's a good DPS increase to have up. Use Death Strike anytime you need healing, that's pretty much it. Use your runes. The more complicated parts of it have changed quite a lot. Two of the biggest adjustments for me are maintaining Death and Decay all the time I'm not tanking, not only in AoE, which that's a pretty substantial change, and using Death's Caress as a regular rotational skill because it's not a skill you have to use on cooldown, but it is a much more efficient option than Marrow Rend for refreshing your Bone Shield charges. This is great. This is actually a pretty big quality of life improvement for DK. It's a little weird, but you're able to use it from range. It substantially reduces the cost of maintaining Bone Shield. It's a good thing, even though it's strange. In terms of cooldown management, you want to try to use your offensive cooldowns, which are Dancing Rune Weapon and either Empower Rune Weapon or Abomination Limb, basically on cooldown. Make sure you won't waste resource generation when you use Empower Rune Weapon or A-Bomb Limb, and definitely don't use A-Bomb Limb if you're holding it for a specific reason, but otherwise, try to use it roughly on cooldown. Summon Ghoul's also a cooldown. He's more of a ghoul down. I'm just going to move on. A lot of the other aspects of DK's toolkit come down to resource management and trying to make sure that you don't cap on a resource. Only 3 runes can cooldown at a time, so always try to have at least 3 on cooldown. Try to always spend your runic power before you hit the cap. Using Death Strike when you don't need healing is fine if it prevents you from overcapping on runic power. Let's move on to stats. Item level is king. Strength increases are the most important stat increases available, and those are usually just a function of item level. Things that are higher item level will have more strength on them. So whenever in doubt, go for more item level. When you're comparing pieces that are around the same item level, haste is the best secondary stat. Your second best option will change a little bit based on what you're tanking and what talents you have, but the difference between the rest of the stats is relatively minor. Always prioritize item level, then haste, then whatever, it doesn't matter. On to Legendaries. Crimson Rune Weapon was the go-to legendary for Blood DK, but it overlaps with the talent tree, and so it doesn't do anything anymore. Pheromones is a really good haste buff legendary when you're standing in Death and Decay, but it doesn't stack with the talent Unholy Ground, which you have to move deeper into the tree, so it doesn't do anything either. Instead, you just wear Super Strain, a very simple, kind of boring, but not bad legendary, and it's okay. You get some extra damage, you get a bit of runic power generation, and that's it. You could run Death's Certainty instead. It's generally not as good. And finally, the best Covenant for Blood DK in the pre-patch is actually Night Fae. Its Covenant ability significantly boosts the value of Death and Decay, and now that Death and Decay is a skill you use all the time rather than just in AoE, this is a really strong synergy with the rest of the class. You could play any of the other Covenants, if you already were Necrolord or Kyrian, and you're more comfortable with that, that's okay, that works fine. But they do add more bar bloat, and having to manage extra offensive cooldowns is a little annoying, especially when you're not even getting a DPS increase out of them compared to the pure passive power of Night Fae. Alright, well that's it. Let me know if you have any questions, like and subscribe, and thanks for watching. Bye.